You've been notified like that the class is dangerous? Not. Yeah. So please register, please register. I need to which class? So that is uh, so I my mom. I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing they'll like uh I know that the right now like this like well not sensitive she would be the one who would be yeah. That, yeah. But I know over like university wide it's not happening. Like students are kind of holding out to the last minute or have other plans. I don't know. I know like I've talked to some students that honestly but some of the classes they don't take up online and there is a online for me that is on off. And people are like, that's not. And so they are like, oh, what is that mean? Oh, I have it. It's so funny that I have it. I accidentally, I can't think of it. I don't know. It's not. Hi, how are you? Hey. So I just do classes and yeah. That is actually really important feedback. So I think we're sharing that because I know that yeah. And you took 2 online. Because I know that there's been like really conversations with TESL thing, especially for education when they're trying to work out teaching schedules and coordinating all of their schedules in terms of like PCE students, elementary ed students, etc. Like just making TESL classes as accessible for any and all of those people as possible. A lot of the information said like we should try to get more and more of our classes on internet. But then to know that there's not registering because of that fee, that's really important for us. So some of them I wouldn't even have noticed because some people their financial exist. It's just all included. So when you think about it, you're like, really not a benefit. That's just ways. if it's like an in-person or other option.
It's like, you know that it is that much. You don't know how they tell you like, you know, you're not. You do. So I have a similar.
There's no winning.
But I don't know if you have an email with the thing and they announced everyone to like basically dinosaurs. Right, right. And they're going to get rid of the things like the food. But one of the me, I don't utilize it. Right, right. But I can't. You cannot opt out of that. You can opt out for things. So I wrote a letter to them and everything, trying to like talk about how franchising and it's not there. Like there are other places like they are talking about that, and they also do. So I don't understand why we have to do it and do it. So we cannot. I'm sure I did it my first semester. Because I want to hear we review before. Yeah, maybe they did. Oh, I didn't try it this semester. Because then I wanted to use it. I forgot I done that, and I went to the city with my kids, and I thought, oh, I have to do that. And it wouldn't work because I had these. So I didn't want to do it. So I didn't try it this semester just in case. I haven't had time, but I was like, how can I find this? So many people don't use that word. Speaker to you. Yeah, yeah.
I don't know, but that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Welcome to the 14 opening for the last class meeting. So we have Professor Gogan from the philosophy department serving us today. As we get started, so on our agenda, first we'll check in about tasks for this week, including we'll talk about your final exam. And then our remaining topic for this week is on interlanguage and other linguistic factors in evaluation. Really focus on the Brown textbook chapter. So so there is a video lecture on U2L from 14, kind of similar to, I think, last week or some of the other weeks. I just recorded the whole thing, and then I'll put it in there later today, kind of like start at a minute, 32 seconds, or whatever, however far we get today. I'll let you know where to start. I'm just not sure how much we'll get in our. You do have a discussion on this, so it's not as usual. It's due on Saturday for that first original post, and then your replies are due the following Monday. Your very last quiz of the semester is also live right now on U2L. That also has to be completed by Monday night as usual. And then your final exam became available this morning, and so you have 2 weeks to work on it. And my strong suggestion for this is always just to pace yourself. So next week, there won't be quizzes. You're already finished with the term project, the language learning journals. So you'll have most of next week to focus on that. But I always just want to encourage you, don't leave it until like night and Monday when you're going to be breaking up. But start to work on it because it's based on 10 kind of paragraphs that you're gonna write.
You just said that.
I've met a few students, that's all. So if you think about it, like if you sort of tender, maybe you say, okay, I'm gonna work on this over the course of 10 days and work on one at a time. Or I'm gonna work on it over the course of 5 days and 2 at a time. Something like that to kind of please yourself. That's what I really would recommend. But it's not wrong. I don't think it should be onerous. But let's look together at the assignment description, just so you can, take this opportunity we're together now to ask whatever questions that you have. Has anyone looked at it yet?
That was maybe for July.
Okay, great. Bonus points for being such on top of students. But if you haven't, that's fine too. It just came live today. So, okay. It's due in the assignments folder. So I think you all know very well at this point how to submit assignments in B2L by Tuesday night at 11:59 p.m. December 6th. If they must be submitted on time, there's just such a tight window for grading final exams and final projects that I can't have late assignments on the final. So please do work ahead and get it on time. Okay, so it says here in the background. Can you read that? Okay. We talked about the fact that few people hold strictly to any one language teaching method, right? And we recognize that each method probably provides something of value that we can apply in our teaching. So we looked at all these different methods: grammar translation method, audiolingual method, direct method, the Suggestopedia, all these different ones that we've looked at this semester. Probably none of us would say, I am now going to be teaching using the direct method. Yeah, right? We would probably say there's things that we could pull from each of those methods in terms of principles and in terms of techniques in our own, in a way that we would sort of put those in a toolbox or a basket as parts of our own, what we might call an eclectic approach. What is eclectic? Unique. Okay. What else? Customize. I like it. Jason, when you think of the word eclectic, what does that mean to you? And it's okay if you say, I don't actually know that word. Yeah, it's okay. Anybody else? Oh, I like that. Outside the box, unique, and kind of customized. This idea, how do you tell? We're just talking a little bit about the final exam. In a great moment. The idea of what the word eclectic means, it's kind of unique to you, and you're kind of pulling from pieces that you might not all belong together in the first place, but you bring them together for yourself. So if you are a person with an eclectic dressing personality, you might take this funky hat and this cool jacket and these cute leggings and put it all together for a very eclectic look, right? Eclectic means you're kind of pulling together a lot of the pieces and doing something unique or different or custom. So what you're going to be doing in your final is describing to me what your eclectic approach to being a teacher of English to speakers of other languages, based on sort of 10 questions. So as I move down here on the assignment description, you are to define your own eclectic approach to teaching English to speakers of other languages in the classroom. The format of this definition, or how you define your own approach, is to consist of answers to the 10 Larson-Freeman questions based on your own point of view. So in this textbook, if you look in the introduction on page 9, these 10 questions are listed. And if you don't have a paper copy of the book, the first chapter is posted in, or the introductory chapter is posted in B2L. So you do have access to this page 9 in one way or another, okay? And it lists those 10 questions. So for example, the first question, not the brown text, the Larson Freeman. Yeah. So it's asking you to describe the principle the approach, the method, or the technique. So the principle is basically sort of the theory or the idea behind why. So for example, the first one asks, what are the goals of teachers who use this method? And when I say this method, I mean Valentina's method, right? I mean Shaiz's method. I'm not asking about grammar translation. I'm not asking about audiolingual. I'm asking about your method, right? So when you see this method, that means your method, okay? And you'll see an example, a few example in a moment, and I think it'll make more sense. But so answering that question with the principle that you believe is most valid and why you intend to follow it in your own teaching practice. Additionally, for each principle that you know, so for each of those 10 questions, you need to identify at least one of the methods, those historical methods we've been studying this semester, suggestipedia, community language learning, direct method, participatory method. Identifying at least one of those methods that follows the principle that you believe in, the principle that you would answer that question with. And then finally, on the exam as a whole, so for on all 10 questions, you have to identify principles from at least 5 methods. So please don't answer direct method, grammar translation, direct method, grammar translation. I need to hear you sort of communicate on with your 10 principles, at least 5 of them that you're identifying in some of those historical methods, at least 5 different historical methods. So, obviously it's going to be a typewritten, single-spaced list of answers. So basically paragraphs, those responding to those 10 questions. And you should identify the question as kind of a subheading. So the what those questions is, question number 1. Thank you. How are the feelings of the students dealt with? That could be a subheading. And you can just let, go 1 through 10. But in each in the form of a short paragraph that covers the principle, why you think it's valid, and the methods it can be found. So overall, it shouldn't probably be more than 3 pages. Now, sometimes I have students emailing me, I'm already at 3 pages and I'm not done. Can I write more? Yeah, it's okay. It's fine if you write a little bit more, but I write 3 pages just to let you know it doesn't need to be a novel. You don't have to write till the end of time. Hi, Mandy. We're talking about the final exam. So in answer to that question number 5, one student might write, the principle that I would apply here is to require my students to assume a new identity for classroom work. Remember how we talk sometimes about second language identity, how some students prefer to, or it might be good to encourage students to kind of pretend like there's someone else in the L2 classroom. I think this is a valid principle. So the student here is sort of justifying why they think it's valid, right? They're giving their why. I think this is a valid principle that will help lower the negative affect that comes with adults learning a new language. If the student assumes a new identity and uses it in the classroom, the identity that is making mistakes is someone else. And I don't have to feel a negative impact on my own self-concept when the errors or inabilities arise. This is a principle found in de-suggestive. So again, this is the question. This is question number 5. They're identifying the principle. What is the sort of theory-based reason or theory-based way they would approach answering that question, how were feelings dealt with? And then an explanation of why that's a valid principle. Why do you believe that's a good way to address this question of how feelings are dealt with? And then identifying one of those historical methods that could be associated with your principle, right? Now, you may have a principal. Can you think of another principal? Or sorry, you may have choose a principle that could be found in more than one method, right? So can you think of, are there other methods we've looked at this semester that had students assume a different L2 identity other than the Suggestopedia?
I'm not gonna give you my answer. That's where it goes.
Good point, Mandy. Sometimes that's one in, I mean, any of the methods that involve a lot of role playing, like
Yeah.
perhaps audiolingual method, might sometimes include learner identities or different L2 identities. So it's like there's not one right answer necessarily for matching a principle to a method. But what I do want you to do is think about those 10 questions. So again, those are here at Larson, Freeman, and Anderson, page 9. These are the 10 questions I want you to answer about your approach. So it's asking, what are the goals of teachers who use Mandy's method? Right?
Can we label it that way?
Sure, that might actually be helpful for you to think about it that way, right? So, and then you maybe will sort of mix yourself up, thinking like, wait, am I talking about one of those historical methods? And think of it as, what are the goals of teachers who use only method, right?
Okay.
And then similarly, like, so the next question, what's the role of the teacher and what is the role of the student? Think about in your classroom, how do I think about the roles of students? What's my role as a teacher? What's students' role in their own learning? Respond to that in terms of the principles or how you respond to that in ways that are consistent with a lot of the theories we've looked at this semester, right? And if you're referring to anything you read in the Larson, Freeman, and Anderson book, if you're referring to anything you read in the Brown book this semester, any of our video and class reflections, anything that we've read or talked about in class this semester, if you're referring to that, go ahead and cite that source, right? We're doing academic writing. This is a kind of like an essay, not exactly an essay, but it is academic writing. So it's an idea that didn't come directly from your brain, but something else you learned in this course this semester, cite that source.
So I have so a lot of these theories and thoughts are put words into what I kind of have already learned.
And you're like, where did this come from, then?
Yeah.
A little bit of mixed up.
Yeah.
I understand. I would say do your best, right? So if you can think to yourself, I know we talked about this whole I+1 idea. What was that called again? I would suggest looking here in the index, see if you can find that input. Who said that? You'll be able to find it. It'll guide you. You'll be able to find, oh, right, Crashen. It was Stephen Crashen who had that comprehensible input idea. And then you can just make reference to that insight. Do your best with that, right? I think you'll be able to find most of the stuff that you're looking for. What else?
So just to clarify.
Yeah.
Page 9 of the green book. That's a question for the.
Yeah. So if you, I was going to say that this is from the introductory chapter, and that is available on B2L, so you shouldn't have any trouble finding it. The first question is, what are the goals of the teachers who use this method, right? And then question 10, how does the teacher respond to student errors?
Right.
Yeah, you're seeing that list?
No, I'm just making sure I write them down on my notes.
Okay. Okay.
First of all, I'll stay. Second of all, making sure.
We have met some students explaining that what are the goals of the teachers using this method to your method.
Right.
Oh, yeah, no, I understood
Okay,
that.
cool.
Yeah, and so make sure you can read through this assignment description really thoroughly, because basically the idea is that you're going to define your own eclectic approach to teaching English to speakers, right? So when it's asking what are the goals of this method, it's Mandy's method, right? What is the
Would it be cool to get that?
Mandy's method.
Yeah.
I knew that guy.
And
He was crazy.
one other important thing I will point out to you is in the Larson, Freeman, and Anderson book, you will find in every single chapter that's on one of the methods. So for example, right now I'm looking in the chapter on desuggested media. Page 78. In each chapter, it goes through review a section called reviewing the principle, where it looks at that specific method in view of these 10 questions. So I'm kind of asking you to do the same thing. What about your own method? So with regards to desuggestipedia, question 1 is the answer. Teachers hope to accelerate the process by which students learn to use another language for everyday communication. In order to do this, more of the students' mental powers must be taxed. This is accomplished by desuggesting the psychological barriers learners bring with them to the learning situation. So that's how, when they're thinking about this method, that's how they're answering that first question about what are the goals of teachers. You will think for yourself about what's your goal? What do you want to have happen for students in your English learning classroom, right? And whatever principle that you determine for yourself, whatever that goal is, identify a method that we discussed this semester that has a very similar goal, right? Because it's going to be different. Remember, who remembers, like, for example, what was the goal of, say, grammar translation method? What was the goal of student studying that? Yeah, so doing a lot of translating of documents specifically, right? So in reading and writing, being able to say, especially in sort of classical languages, so Latin or ancient Greek, being able to read that language, translate the document into your first language, and the other way around, translate documents in your first language into the other language. Really, the goal was not to be able to effectively communicate in the language, right? I'm not trying to learn ancient Greek to chitty chat with my friends, those ancient Grecians, right? That wasn't the goal of that particular method. So the goal of all of them is not the same. It's not just, well, learn to use English, right? There were different thinking, there were different ways of thinking about what are we trying to accomplish with language learning. So think about for yourself, what is my goal for my students? How do I express that goal? How do I respond to that in terms of principle? And then which method is most closely aligned with my goal? And then do that for each one of those questions. Go ahead, Sarah.
And it's okay if I like base my method after the test.
Oh, sure. Being informed by the particular age of students and the field that is intended to serve them. Absolutely. So that makes sense. Yeah. You don't have to think, just because it's your eclectic approach, you don't have to think super original thoughts about it. You're not the first, you're not the first person to be ever thinking, what does a 4-year-old? So yeah, I'm very much encouraging sort of integrating everything basically. Other questions?
So just to clarify, so for example, my future hopefully students will be adult learners.
Yeah.
So if I answer these questions, I'm very these methods, and I specifically say, okay, this is what I want to use for adult learners, then that is fine if I do it that way.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I think it's good to identify that specifically. So those of you who are early childhood majors, those of you who are planning to high school students, yes, I think that makes a lot of sense because the principles that will align best with your method may be different depending on the age of your learners. They have different needs, right? Yeah, absolutely. Other questions?
Can we go home then?
You have other things to discuss today.
Then
Jason. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely you can. So if you're going back through, say, the Larson, Freeman, and Anderson text, and you're remembering, well, I really liked that thing in the participatory approach about how they took these real life topics and they had students engaged in different activities from that. So that I'm going to take a principle from that. But then I was also thinking about task-based language teaching and how effective it was when they did these projects related to teaching. So I'm going to take a principle from that. So that is exactly the idea, Shane, that you're pulling different principles and ideas from a variety of facts. Thanks for that. It's fun to ask these questions. If you have a question, it's not silly. Probably your classmates also have that question. Or if you ask it, they'll realize they had the question before they even knew it. We'll also be meeting next Tuesday, so maybe after you spent a little bit of time getting going on it, new questions may arise for you. You could ask those next week as well. As always, it's not a collaborative process for the final exams. It's something you should be doing on your own, so please don't work together on it. Please don't go to a tutor and say, I need some help with just this little project. That's definitely not an exam. This is something you need to work on your own, but I'm happy to answer any questions about this. Okay, so if you want to also send me an email or meet with me during office hours, all right. Then, continue. Okay, so in chapter 9 of Brown, which is the last one in Brown that we're going to be covering in this course, we get into the idea of interlanguage, sometimes known as learner language, or basically the language that a learner uses at various stages of acquisition of a second language. So it's just a brief overview of what we sort of looked at this semester. We looked at several categories of factors that can influence second language acquisition. The first were a lot of different psychological factors. So we looked at 3 different psychological schools of thought: behavioralists, cognitive school of thought, and then social constructivist school. We looked at a lot of social factors, such as things like acquiring a second culture, in addition to just acquiring a second language. The idea of social distance, or how different or similar the L1 and L2 cultures are. The idea of communicative competence, or actually being able to use a language to communicate effectively, not just knowing things about a language. About the difference between basic interpersonal communication skills and cognitive academic language proficiency. Language functions or stuff that do with language, or accomplish with language, like apologizing, requesting, responding, all of those different sort of social factors. We've also looked a little bit at political factors related to acquiring a second language. Mostly issues related to sort of power dynamics, social power, cultural power, issues domestically, issues globally related to like second language acquisition. And now onto some of the more specifically linguistic factors, things that have to do with pieces of language itself. One of the historical ways of thinking about linguistic factors in second language acquisition was called the contrastive analysis hypothesis. It was very much based in behavioral psychology and structural linguistics. And it was focused on comparing the structure of L2 and the structure of L1, and highlighting areas where the 2 languages are different. So finding areas where they're the same, but highlighting areas in which those languages are different. We talked a bit about the idea of transfer and interference. Who remembers what those things are? What's transfer?
Much of the language can be used in English.
Yeah, so ways that, for example, a person's first language facilitates or helps them in learning a new language. So what can be kind of like to your way of putting it, what can be useful in, for example,
Spanish and Italian.
if one has or knows Spanish as their first language and they're trying to acquire Italian, do you know examples of transfer from Spanish to Italian?
Yeah. The greeting, ¿cómo estás?
Uh-huh.
In Italian is ¿cómo estás? ¿Cómo estás? ¿Cómo estás? ¿Cómo va?
Uh-huh.
¿Cómo va?
Uh-huh.
Buongiorno. Buenos días.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
My favorite one is the library.
Okay.
Like in a lot of languages, library is the same, closely to it, except the language and our
Uh-huh.
Spanish. People think that they were the language that was, but there's a transfer.
Right. So a lot of you gave examples of a lot of cognates, right? So cognates are words that sound very similar and indeed mean very similar things. Cognates. There are a lot because Spanish and Italian are both the base of Latin. We've got a lot of cognates, Spanish, Italian, French.
Pronunciation. I use this one example. I kind of hilarious, but pronunciation in Spanish and Japanese.
Uh-huh.
Where we're using words like thank you, Japanese, arigato. And gato is in Spanish.
Well, but you're correct in that even though those are not cognates at all, right?
No, but we're finding those the things that transfer as mentioned in the previous slide.
Yeah.
So I found that using that example, a lot of the pronunciations in Spanish are equal to a lot of pronunciations in Japanese. So which to my advantage helped me pronounce Japanese better than most of the students in my class. And even the teacher was surprised at my pronunciation. Thank you.
Okay. So even though, so the transfer is not at the level of vocabulary, it's not at the level of a definition of a word, but it is at the level of pronunciation. So these phonemes, gato, right, are very similar in the second part of the word, arigato, right? So the transfer that we experience is the ability to produce those phonemes because we have similar phonemes, individual sounds in our first language, right? Another common example of transfer, especially for students who are a little bit older, acquiring a second language, is just literacy. The ability to read and write in your first language, even if it's in a totally different script than the second language that you're learning, allows for a lot of transfer because you already have an established concept and practice of symbols having meaning, that then that ability has some significant transfer in your acquisition of a second language. Those are examples of transfer. But what's the interference? Yeah, so interference is kind of, it's a similar idea, but instead of helping, the first language can sort of get in the way of acquiring the second language or kind of causes us to make mistakes in the second language. Can you think of examples of interference?
Italian and Spanish.
Okay, yeah, exactly. Tell me more.
I mix them both. So when I'm trying to speak Italian, I'm speaking a mix of it. Spanish and Italian. I don't say como está, como está. And I've been corrected on that. Like if I were to start speaking, I would mix Spanish. Buongiorno, me llamo. I would say me llamo. Like it's just mixing it. So it's the similarity sounds of it that it gets to the point where I'm mixing languages.
Just sort of mixing up the cognates, right? The words or phrases are so similar that you kind of get confused about which one you're supposed to use in which language, right? Other examples of interference are.
So when I was learning German, just the sentence structure depending on the
Okay.
So sometimes it's very straightforward, whether a object or your word, but sometimes it's like a word or your object. And so that can kind of be confusing and interfering.
Absolutely. So word order or syntax differences. That can become very confusing when we're used to subject, verb, object, I love you, and maybe the language that we're trying to learn as subject, object, verb, or some other typical order, or kind of can depend on the context, and then it gets all kind of funky with German and English being derived originally from German. Our brains can have a hard time wrapping themselves around. We expect things to be more similar than sometimes they are, right?
I wouldn't say it like that. Or the literal meaning. Sometimes because you're translating it from English to, but literally that is not the meaning of the German sentence.
So it seems like the pieces all come together, but the overall impact then is just wrong. It doesn't add up.
I don't know what's called. Would you pronounce it? For example, they're two different sounds. I'm writing the same thing.
Like some diacritic.
Kind of like in Spanish, they have the accents,
Mhm.
something like that, and it makes a difference.
In which language?
Spanish and the
In both of those. Yeah.
because we have the accents
For stress part.
for certain ones and everything, and the dictations and different.
Yeah. So yeah, that's another good example of the can sort of get confused about where sort of both what's the word when you're breaking things down to individual syllable stress versus word stress and that kind of thing, depending on what their diacritic mark. Another one, kind of the opposite of cognates or related to cognates, false friends, sometimes we call them, which are words that sure seem like they should be cognates, but they don't think it. So your example of library, right? That's a good one in English, library, but in Spanish, what does librería?
It does.
Bookstore. Very similar, but not the same, right? Or my favorite. I'm spelling embarrassed, 1 R, 2 R's. We'll leave that alone for now, but embarrassed. I say, oh, yo estoy embarazada. Pregnant. Not embarrassed at all, although you are after you make that mistake. You have done in real life. So false friends sometimes is another example of interference, ways that our first language seems like it should be helping, but it's actually kind of getting in the way of acquiring our second language. Can there be maybe reverse interference where you become so proficient in your second language that it actually starts to impact how you use your first language?
Yeah, I interviewed someone from my classes. She's been living this for a while, and she uses the first or she uses with English in her like basically mixing them all the time.
Yeah. So sometimes I've known adult learners of English who, maybe I'm thinking of one person in particular who she immigrated and she started learning English here in the United States when she was in about middle school, then all through high school, college, graduate school, did all of that here in the United States. So although her first language from home is still her mother tongue, she can speak it and use it with her family and that sort of thing. She would never have much of an opportunity to develop more of her academic and professional vocabulary, which all happened in sort of later in her life, from the time she was maybe 12 on, only in English. So she has these big sort of vocabulary gaps in her first language, and also pronunciation. So for example, this person was describing going, like sort of back and talking with old friends, and they were talking about going to university, and that was a cognate with her first language. I think it was something like, let's say, something like that. But it would be pronounced université, but she said université, right? She put that English where it should have just been. So it's a reversed interference where the second language pronunciation, the phonemes got mixed up from the second language back into the first. I'm also thinking of the example that you gave me on accident a couple of weeks ago,
Oh.
where you saw the word established.
Yeah.
Right? And you said,
Is that
"Are you
right?
sure that's right?" Because you thought
It was
it
that
was just established, right? And why did you think that?
because when I was learning English, I was supposed to make that sound. Certain words like stop.
Right.
No, it's don't stop.
And so a common example of interference for Spanish speakers is that it's very hard to pronounce words that begin with S and then a consonant. So ST, SK, these kinds of words, stop, school, etc. Without a vowel sound before it, right? In Spanish, that just wouldn't exist. You wouldn't have a word that is S consonant. It would always be escuela, escuela, especialmente, lots of other words, but you wouldn't have it. So for Spanish speakers, a lot of interference that they experience with pronunciation is they'll put that in front of S consonant words. The reverse transfer of it then was then Manny having it so ingrained in his head, you gotta take that off,
Yeah, no, yeah.
right? That you thought it didn't belong in a place where it actually does, that the word is actually established and not established, right? I love that example.
Couldn't comprehend this.
Because it just shows how hard you work to integrate the rule, that it's over applying the rule in a place it doesn't belong. So okay, sorry, I feel like I got a little far afield, but the idea with the contrastive analysis hypothesis is that there are these areas of similarity between an L1 and L2. There are also areas of difference between an L1 and L2. So we highlight the areas of difference, and the assumption was, or the whole hypothesis really was, that interference, differences between L1 and L2, interference has this negative effect on L2, gets in the way of acquiring L2. So, and also, where no interference exists, where L1 and L2 have a lot of similarities, no difficulty will exist. The assumption was, in places where we have transfer, no issues. So other than those issues of interference, language abilities transfer and have a positive effect. So really, if that's the case, if we have transfer and there's just the sort of obstacle of interference, second language acquisition is quite simply just a matter of overcoming interference, focusing in on those areas that are different between L1 and L2 really should be the key of acquiring the second language. Now, there were some very strong claims made about this hypothesis in the 1950s and the 1960s. And they even went so far as to develop these very specific hierarchies of different difficulty, looking at some very specific sort of language factors. So this linguist called Stockwell developed these specific 8 phonological levels. So looking specifically at languages in terms of these 8 sort of points about individual sounds, and 16 grammatical levels. So looking at issues related to morphology or how words change shape, change meaning, or syntax, word order. He identified 16 grammatical levels, and said if we just compare an L1 and L2 based on these different levels, we can determine exactly where students will find interference and therefore difficulty, really help them to study and perfect their use of the L2 form that's different from the L1 form, and that will be the easy. That was one. There was also Prater, another linguist, who identified a different hierarchy of difficulty. The first one was just transfer. So if we were comparing an L1 and an L2, if there's no difference on a particular point between those, so whether it's looking at sounds or perhaps cognates between words, that's the 0 level, no difficulty there. But then we go to the next level, which he called coalescence. So this is where, again, comparing an L1 and an L2, where different items become one item. So perhaps in English, when we're thinking about the words his and her, like a possessive determiner, in English we have 2, they're gendered. And really 3, his, her, and their. But in Spanish, all of those become su, right? Su libro is your book, whether or his or her book, his, her, their book. It's all of those things. Where in English, you have multiple options. So that's one area of what they call coalescence, one area of difficulty. Slightly more difficult, Prater said, was undifferentiation. So again, comparing an L1 and L2, this is the category where it said what exists in one language is just absent in another. So it doesn't become a different thing, it's just not there. The example of do, the auxiliary verb in English questions. So for example, when I ask a question, something like, do you have a book? In Spanish, for example, pianist, do you have? All of those words. It took us 3 words in English, and in Spanish, do you have? That's all within the verb of have. A book. So if our first language is English, we're kind of in our brains looking for the do, right? And it's not there. That's what he called undifferentiation, that there's a feature in our first language. And this is similar in Korean, although I don't have any privilege in Korean. But we are sort of looking for it, or we're trying to wrap our heads around, like, why is it not there? We have to kind of have this, overcome this interference where we're looking for a feature of our first language that doesn't exist in the second language.
I never thought of that.
Right, and this is actually, so teaching English language for this question formation is pretty tricky, to tell you the truth. A lot because of the do auxiliary verb. And then when it's like WH question words, like why do you have a book, or where do you have a book? It's all of that with that auxiliary verb plus the base word. Yeah. So question formation can be really tricky, especially depending on the student's first language and how much interference they're experiencing. The next level of difficulty we call reinterpretation. So this is where something in L1 and in the L2 in both languages is different. So the example of French nasalization. So like the word bon, good in French, again, I don't have to in French at all, but they have this sort of nasalized vowel, bony, bon. If our L1 is English, we're trying to kind of use what we know, like a word like bone, but it's not the same. It's a different phoneme than this kind of nasalized vowel, where you don't ever, like your tip of your tongue never reaches that palate above. Try it with me. Versus it doesn't happen in the same way. So the idea with this is that there's a phoneme over here in L1 and there's a phoneme over here in L2, and don't line up. So we're trying to sort of reinterpret a new phoneme into our understanding or into our sort of articulation abilities. Next, we identified what we call over differentiation. This is when there's something in the L2 that's not in the L1. So different from here, like there's a similar phoneme, but not the same versus. But different is it exists in L2. It doesn't exist in L1. And we have to sort of over differentiate, call it. So the example is English speakers, we don't typically have gendered nouns, right? Whereas in many languages, but particularly these European languages do have gendered nouns, right? So like table is female somehow. Not literally, they don't actually make like person with a gender, but we have that built into our language for some of these languages. So we have to sort of adopt that in L2, and it's a challenging area of transfer because it impacts then the determiner or the word before it. So we can't just say table in English and make a table, but mesa, then we have to know its gender because it depends. It matters because, or I should say, the table. You would say la mesa, you wouldn't say el mesa. That's the determiner that goes before a male noun, right? So gender matters in a lot of these languages, and if I don't have them in my first language, it creates this interference, this over differentiation, and it matters because there's pieces that go with it. Similarly, in Korean, in Mandarin, in Polish, those languages either don't have articles, so articles meaning words like a, the, and, right? Or they use them very differently than we do in English. So again, you can tell frequently talking to people who like thinking of Polish speakers, for example, it is extremely difficult for an L1 Polish speaker to figure out where do we put a, where do we put the, where do we put an, and where do we put no article? Because sometimes we talk about the table, sometimes we talk about a table, sometimes we just talk about tables. But that's kind of one of the highest levels of difficulty, honestly, figuring out correct usage of determiners in English. Yeah, Angel.
Yeah, something that was like confusing when I was like learning Japanese. It was like you can like say like a sentence where you can like introduce your like gender into it. So like if like a guy was like saying like this like my TV, it was like saying Boku, so then it'd be like Boku is basically like a word used specifically like for a male, like that, so something like that.
So this is my TV, and you might say that differently if you're a man than the way a woman would construct the same sentence. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
I thought it was too much. So I was being taught from a male perspective, but I should have said.
Be able to construct those sentences appropriately. Yeah.
But when it comes to book, it's mostly used for little kids. Like it's been outdated. Now it's what the shit.
I was in like 10 years ago. So I don't think it's changed.
That's interesting because I was taught what actually meant.
So even that's a good example though, because this is my TV. You're saying.
Well, actually, what I know that it's a book.
And that you would say that differently depending on your age. Like a child would say it in a certain way versus a
so what I was taught is that book was mostly for children. Children like a young child. But when you start growing, you start using more what the she is like the person itself.
And so that would be either an example of this over differentiate this idea that there's something exists in the second language that doesn't in my first, so I have to kind of figure out how to even use it Or maybe, maybe coalescence, or this idea that, there's two different ways to do it in the L2, whereas there's only one way to do it in L1. So you have to navigate and do. So also, yes. So split is the final sort of level of difficulty that I identified, and this is where one L1 item becomes two. So in Spanish, the preposition en, it's just we have this one, whereas in English, we sometimes say in and we sometimes say on, depending, right? So we might go, we might get in the car, but we get on the bus, right? What's the difference between the car and the bus? Really, not that much. In Spanish, you probably say, well, you think por el autobús.
En el autobús.
En el autobús, okay. And en el coche, en el carro.
Coche.
Yeah. So it's the same, we got one item, but in English, two items, and you have to figure out the context for one or the other, right? Or the other way around, in English, for, another preposition. In Spanish, either por or para, right? And you have to figure out which one is appropriate in the right situation. That I still find very difficult. I told you many times, that she does a small child, but por and para still very mysterious to me. How when you choose which, but that's a split. That's when in the first language there's one item, in the second language there's two, and you have to put the right context. So these were the kind of again, many different linguists develop these different hierarchies where they said you're looking at specific kind of points in comparing L1 and L2 will identify these differences, and then we just have to help learners to overcome the interference they're experiencing, and that will be the key to second language acquisition. It will be we just focus on the differences. Well, but and let me stop before I go on. What do you think of that? Is it a helpful idea that we sort of thinking of our language teaching first or primarily in terms of capitalizing or building on the things that are similar between L1 and L2, and then really helping students to overcome the things that are different? Is it a helpful hypothesis?
I think so, because individually, we understand it as educators and people understand their complicated process. When I'm searching for a new language to snap on, if you will, I love to see how familiar I am with that language based on the other languages I've learned. Most of this one sounds myself, and go like, yeah, completely off the rails. Nothing is similar. They usually sort of scaffold. So it's like, okay, I know this about German. So Dutch and German have a lot of stuff in common, and I can kind of play with that. And then when I started learning Polish, I was like, ooh, and what's German here? So I started building on that.
I like, yeah, the word use of scaffolding is kind of this idea of like building on the knowledge that I already have. There's these sort of hooks, mental hooks that I can sort of hang my hat on and build on those things. And that will really just kind of then to find those areas in which they're different, and then that can help me sort of, or that can be sort of key to overcoming and acquiring. If I can kind of identify, oh, okay, well, Dutch and German have to be very similar. I can develop a lot of vocabulary pretty easily, and then maybe just identify, oh, different phonetic things that are different, and focus on pronunciation.
And it's also like, if you're in a room with a lot of different language learners, just kind of like you can't pick all of their languages. But just knowing that they're going to have that difficulty can give you another layer.
Yeah, this is a great point, and I like how you put that in. You will much more than likely teaching in settings where students don't share first language. Not all of them. There may be many who have, you know, a lot of. If you're going to be teaching in public school with kids, you're going to have a lot of Spanish, Polish, Mandarin, Arabic. But they'll be in the mix with a lot of others, right? A lot of your other schools, particularly well, really all over the city, but especially on the north side, you're going to have 30, 40 home languages spoken. You're not going to be able to know those all, but maybe having some knowledge of here are the things for those major common language first languages, identifying what things are going to be the greatest areas of interference, knowing that can be helpful in helping your students to identify what's down. But other thoughts how this strikes you, focusing in on the areas of difference between first languages and second languages, that being kind of the key to effectively acquire.
I was mentioned, like we spoke before, earlier in the classes, integration of the language, building up on it. I forget the theory, but this is an example of that because that student. Words, and rather than having them use and focus on different subjects, we'll focus on the weaknesses.
Right. So maybe that's right. Professor doesn't have that, but what is this kind of problem? Yeah. So, like, can you help me understand? Grammar down fast in your first language. So, when it's like, oh, well, the grammar's the same, so we don't have to go over it. Perfect in your first language, you could still be making mistakes, right? So you can have mistakes in the areas where they go. Yeah, that is a good point, especially like especially when people working about like grammar in particular, like students may or even just having writing at all, like literacy at all in their first language. We have a lot of students that don't from school to have a fully formed first language and listening and speaking, who may not be able to read like the first language at all. Generation 1.5, but what's the word? It's a sort of population identified of students who typically either were born in a sort of society of that uses a different language than their home language. So, for example, an immigrant family here in the United States speaks their family's first language at home, but then in school, probably starting preschool or kindergarten, do all of school in a second language. So either they were born, say, here in the United States, or they immigrated very young. So to sort of differentiate, when you talk about a first generation immigrant, that's typically the people who came, right? So if this, for some of you, maybe your parents immigrated here from another country, they're the first generation. And then if you were born here in the United States, then you're considered to be the second generation. But sometimes, in terms of a person's language development, a thing happens where, like I said, that they have a first home language. They come to pre-K or kindergarten and then start school and develop listening, speaking, reading, and writing in a second language without the opportunity to develop literacy in their first language, right? Without the opportunity to develop literacy, reading and writing specifically in their first language.
Yeah, is this for like also like what happened? Like I was born here, but I was like at home I would speak Spanish.
Sure.
And then when I started school, like we had like a bilingual like class I was in where they would teach us like English basically. And so like I learned how to like talk in Spanish. But like I don't know how to like write it, like my writing skills like really bad.
So you didn't do much reading and writing in Spanish. They moved you quickly into reading and writing in English. Is that right?
Yeah.
So this is exactly that kind of situation. So as a result, all of the research really clearly indicates that if a child has the opportunity to develop literacy, reading and writing in their first language, either first or at the same time as first and second language literacy. So maybe Spanish literacy, reading and writing first, or English. This is just an example. It could be any two languages, but English Spanish, reading and writing, same time, simultaneously, same time. These will result in the best outcomes for that student in the long run in terms of their literacy in the second language. Definitely in terms of the L1, but I'll write L1 and L2. So for a long time, and maybe for your generation, Angel, the thinking was, we don't want them to get behind in reading and writing English, so let's just start them on that right away. The research didn't really bear that out in the long run, that if these students were given the opportunity to develop literacy in Spanish first, or literacy at the same time in English and Spanish, that in the long run, their English literacy, their English reading and writing will be better, as well as their Spanish reading and writing. So it didn't save time in the end, right? So this is why sometimes this generation 1.5 will get to college. They're listening and speaking. You can't distinguish them from a native English speaker, right? If I met you on the street, I would not know that you had a different first language, right? Because you have a fully developed reading or listening and speaking in English. But for some students, I'm not saying this is true of you, Angel, I don't mean that, but for some of them, their reading and writing really never fully develops. And so they may even have been sort of the valedictorian of their high school, and they get to college and they have very underdeveloped academic writing and reading skills. And it really traces back to this initial experience of not having the opportunity to develop literacy in their first language.
I mean, I could say I'm not. I wouldn't say like that my
No.
writing in English is like good, to be honest.
I don't know that this applies to you, Angel, because I think your writing is great. But again, I don't mean to put you on the spot like that. But this is true of a lot of students in the United States, particularly of these immigrant backgrounds, that lost opportunity to develop their literacy in their first language from the first results in over the long. It's not that it can't be overcome. It's not that it just takes a lot longer. So those students are having to work much harder throughout their education to continue to develop their academic reading and writing skills because they started from a different place. They didn't have the opportunity for transferring literacy skills from the first language to the second language. That really would have kind of best set them up for long-term success. Not exactly. It's all. Back to the contrastive analysis hypothesis, this idea, let's just focus on the differences, really laser in on those things, that was key. It really was never very empirically supported. So there weren't a lot of studies to show this is really effective, that if you focus on the areas of interference, those students will be much more effective language learners. And it hasn't been shown to be very predictive. So when you use those kind of hierarchies of comparing L1s to L2s and seeing, okay, these things are different. So these are going to be areas that are especially hard for a particular L2 learner or L1 learner of an L2. They sometimes give us some insight into what will be hard for students, but not always. Or a lot of it was very first. And in fact, a sort of similar idea related to contrastive analysis of cross-linguistic or the idea that things that you learn sort of earlier in your process of acquiring the language will impact your learning performance, but influence doesn't necessarily equal prediction. So kind of start identifying when I already sort of know these things in German, maybe they'll help me when I'm trying to acquire Dutch. Those things, the researchers, like Aller and TESL, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that person's name. They did studies that found that actually subtle differences between, say, an L1 and an L2 may actually be more difficult than glaring differences. So looking at languages that actually have a lot of similarities, they found sometimes students have greater challenge learning, say, Italian when they have Spanish. And specifically, that acquiring a second dialect of the same language can sometimes be more difficult than acquiring an entirely different language. Why might that be the case? Why might it actually be harder to acquire a sort of different dialect of your same language than acquiring an entirely different language?
Well, that was a beautiful example of Spain, Spanish, and Mexican.
Yeah. Okay. Talk a little bit more about that.
So, particular words in Spain, Spanish does not translate equally to Mexican Spanish. And certain words translate to bad words in Spain, Spanish. And I learned that
Right. So because there's, so much more similarity, but then these places of difference that are really key and important, it can be a lot harder to integrate just those fewer differences than almost like your sort of mindset going to something that's very different. You're expecting to notice a lot more differences. If you're almost like maybe you're more not on guard enough, like you're speaking Mexican Spanish with Spain Spanish. Right?
Colombian continue that when I'm speaking with them, I apologize. Hey, listen, if I say something wrong, I don't feel offend you. It's my Spanish, so if I say anything, just let me know.
Right. Or even like some dialects of English have very different pronunciations. And for me to try and say acquire the different pronunciation of a different dialect, even American English, I was thinking of a friend of mine in graduate school who's from Detroit, and at one point she told me she was going to go get an oil change, like in her car, and I had to go get my oil change. And I was just so unfamiliar with the pronunciation in her dialect. The way she kept saying it was like like it was the L's were much like because L and R actually in a lot of languages those two hormones get confused, right? Korean is one. But in her, the way that she spoke, I just couldn't hear it. Or the way she said change too, but oil especially is like I was so embarrassed. Because I kept asking her to repeat herself, and she did, and it became like we were both very embarrassed with interaction. Like, we're speaking the same language, and we can't understand each other, and neither of us are quite sure what's happening right now. And so, if I was to try to acquire her pronunciation features, I think that would be actually much harder for me than working on Spanish, where I expect everything to be different, and I don't have these, pronunciations I'll continue to fall back on in my own dialect. So this kind of flies in the face of contrastive analysis hypothesis. Because it's saying the opposite. This study is saying subtle differences are harder to learn, whereas contrastive analysis hypothesis, just look at the big things that are much different, figure out the differences, and then you eliminate interference, you're good to go.
In this hypothesis, fits more the TESL other than TESL.
Okay.
In the case of TESL, you are working with a group of students who have the same language, one language.
Yeah.
They're at the same level, and then they're into what they know.
I think that's a great point, Mandy. If you go to Japan, for example, and you're teaching a room full of L1 Japanese speakers, you can very quickly, with a little bit of study, figure out, okay, I know these are going to be the pronunciation challenges because they don't have the difference between L and R, another one, Japanese. That I know that they're going to have, difference in terms of word order because typical word order is this in Japanese. You'll be able to focus in with a monolingual group that is more typical in an ESL setting So contrastive analysis may be more useful in those kinds of settings, perhaps less useful in classrooms where there's all manner of home languages. In what ways can you, so that's one example in the EFL setting of where it would be useful. Can, just with our last second here, can you think of other ways in which contrastive analysis hypothesis might be useful to you as a teacher?
Identifying different levels.
What
Of, so rather than looking at it as a whole group, identify what student the student needs. So rather than making it a whole group interaction, focus on the single student. So that way we can knock out the whole, okay, he doesn't know how to read Spanish or read Spanish. Stuff like that. So individual assessment rather than group.
When you're looking at individual students and you're saying, something I'm noticing about this person, they're having a hard time with, say, question formation. I wonder what that's about. Let me do a little bit of digging. Do they have a do auxiliary verb in the student's first language? Sometimes just identifying that for an individual student and working with them on it. This is different in your language. Here's in English why that seems so challenging. And sometimes we can really focus work with students with that. All right, we're out of time. It's actually a pretty good place for us to stop. So I will post on D2L the sort of minutes at which you can start watching the video lecture for the second half of this week's content. But everything will be, in the classroom as usual on D2L. Let me know if you want to think about very happy things. Everyone enjoys just a little break. Maybe some food, time with family.
No break, got catch up.
Okay, well, there's that too. There is.
No.
At least there's that. At least get one.
One over there. How wonderful we do. Bye-bye. So much.